Well, thank you very much, Sandy. Very beautiful words and very beautiful song. Sure has a lot of meaning. I appreciate that song. Matter of fact, here a few years back, probably one of the first times I heard that song when it first came out. I'm not sure how long it's been out. But I heard a doctor do a report, and he was talking about the actual heart. And he said that he actually did a surgery on a lady, a heart transplant. And he put the heart in her, he closed her back up, and when they were finished, nothing happened. And he said he simply reached down and went to her ear and said, whatever her name was, Sarah, tell your heart to beat again. And it started beating. It's amazing. It's amazing. God has created such an amazing creation in us. How can anybody, deny that and deny Him? So thank you very much, Sandy, for that special music. It's very beautiful. So some of you have seen and responded to a post that I submitted last night on our Portsmouth-Paintsville group. I put that on there just, again, to give us something to think about and to kind of lead into what we want to talk about today. And it was very good and very encouraging to see your comments. And I appreciate that. I appreciate you taking time to put some thought into some of these topics. But as I get started today, I want to share with you four brief, if you will, but very great examples of the very topic of obedience and submission. That's what I want to talk about, obedience and submission of the heart. And it's kind of ironic that that was the special music, Tell Your Heart to Beat Again, kind of a form of self-submission, submits to God's way and what we should be doing. But these examples, the first one we'll look at, again, there's four of them here, we'll go over real quickly, and then we'll get into the main heart of everything. This first one is Jesus' example. Jesus, he always did the Father's will. And we talked about that just a couple weeks ago. Even when it was painful for him, even when it was going to cost him his life, he did the Father's will. And one of the most famous expressions of this is in the Garden of Gethsemane. And this first scripture I'm going to look at is Luke 22, verse 42. It's where God desires this cup to pass from him, but notwithstanding, he says in Luke 22, verse 42, nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. Brother, absolutely the perfect example of obedience and submission to authority. There's no other way to look at it. How about another example? This is an example of Abraham. When God called Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, we can turn there quickly, Genesis chapter 12, we see absolutely no hesitation on his part to obey God. In Genesis chapter 12, verse 1 and 2, it says this, the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. There was a purpose, and this is part of what we're going to talk about today. God told Abraham to do something. He said, go from the land that you are in now. You're familiar with this. He said, leave it. And he said, leave your kindred. And he said, leave your father's house. But there's a reason. He told him, because I'm going to make you a great nation, Abraham. I'm going to populate the world with your seed. This is what he was telling me. There's a reason. God doesn't do anything without there being a reason. Another one is Saul to Paul, if you will. This is in Acts chapter 8. We'll look at that, Acts chapter 8. Saul here, before he became the Apostle Paul, what was he doing? Well, he was going around, he was ravaging churches, consenting in the death of many of the brethren. But Saul was just about to meet his match. Let's take a look at this in Acts chapter 8 and verse 1. We'll start in verse 1. There arose on that day a great persecution against the church in Jerusalem, and they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. Look at verse 3. We see here, Saul was ravaging the churches and entering house after house. He dragged off men and women and committed them to prison. Can you imagine being in your home right now and the door being kicked in and this government authority coming in, maybe or maybe not asking you a question, are you a Christian? Are you keeping the Sabbath, the holy days? And you say yes, and immediately, without explanation, being dragged off, taken to prison, and knowing that you might just be killed. That's what Paul was doing. He had a part of this. Let's go forward to chapter 9, verse 1. Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, that's you and me, brethren, went to the high priest and asked for a letter to go to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any belonging to the way, to God's way of life, to a Christian life that you and I know, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. Then guess what happens? Verse 3. But suddenly a light from heaven shone around him, and falling to the ground, he heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And he said, Who are you, Lord? And he said, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. You see what's happening here? We're starting, Saul was extremely obedient to his authorities in persecuting Christians. He was submissive. He did what had to be done. And now the authority that he submitted to, he obeyed, is about to change. Look at verse 6. So he, trembling and astonished, said, Lord, what do you want me to do? What a change of attitude. Then you drop down to verse 20. After 3 days here, we see this, Acts 9, verse 20 through 22. Immediately he, Saul, proclaimed Jesus in the synagogues. Isn't that just completely opposite of what he did just a short while back? Saying, He is the Son of God. And all who hear him were amazed and said, Is it not this the man who made havoc in Jerusalem of those who called upon his name? They're saying, this is the guy who was just killing anybody who said they belonged to Jesus Christ. And has he not come here for this purpose, to bring them bound before the chief priests? People were confused. But Saul increased in all the more in strength and confounded the Jews who lived in Damascus by proving that Jesus was the Christ. So he not only obeyed, but he submitted. There's a difference. We'll talk about it here in a minute. He not only obeyed, but he submitted. And then he went full steam ahead. Do we do that, brethren? Do we obey? Do we submit to the right things? And then do we go full steam ahead? Or do we obey, partially submit, and question? This is what he did. Saul knew he was to suffer very much for Christ. He knew this. He knew going in, this is not going to be an easy road. But yet he joyfully took on his commission to the Gentiles. What a great example. This is one of the reasons that I appreciate Paul's story so much, because we, as Christians in this world, can relate to Paul. We can understand what he's doing. Look at one more example here, and this is Mary. I think you'll be hard-pressed to find a greater example of obedience than this here in Mary, the very mother of Jesus. When she discovered that she was to bear the Son of God, and still yet being a virgin, she could hardly believe it. It didn't make sense to her. Turn with me to Luke chapter 1. Luke chapter 1, verses 26 through 30. Now in the 6th month, the angel Gabriel was sent by God to a city of Galilee named Nazareth, to a virgin betrothed to a man whose name was Joseph, of the house of David. The virgin's name was Mary. And having come in, the angel said to her, "Rejoice, highly favored one. The Lord is with you." What a title. Highly favored one. Wouldn't it be great to be called of God and Jesus Christ, the highly favored one? We are, because he has called us out of this world. He said here, "Rejoice, highly favored one. The Lord is with you. Blessed are you among women." But when she saw him, she was troubled at him, saying, and considered what manner of greeting this was. Then the angel said to her, "Do not be afraid, Mary, for you have found favor in God." These are 4 quick examples, and the Bible is full of examples of godly people obeying and submitting to God, to the authorities. And it doesn't just mean godly authorities. It does include that, but it includes all authority. And there's many, many other examples of God's people, Christians, who do not obey and submit. And it doesn't work out so well for them. I'm not going to go to the negative side of that. I want to stay on the positive side of this today. So if you will, join me in Hebrews chapter 13. We'll see a command. This is for everyone, for all of us, everyone here today. And I say here, I mean present. On the Cybercast, everyone, not just in the Portsmouth-Paintsville, but this is for all of God's people. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 17. Because this is where it starts. Paul, as we understand him to be the writer of Hebrews, he said this, "Obey those who rule over you, and be submissive, for they watch out for your souls, as those who must give an account." And this is talking spiritual and civil or civic. They have to give an account too. So keep that in mind. Let them do so with joy and not with grief, for that would be unprofitable for you. Do we understand what this is saying? Obey those who rule over you and be submissive. This issue of submission tends to cause a very great misunderstanding among God's people. It has for years, and it probably will for years. But we need to get a handle on it. We need to come to understand this. Again, the writer here, Paul, he distinctly exhorts us to do 2 things right in this verse here. Number 1, to obey those who rule over us. And number 2, to be submissive to those who rule over us. There is different directives here. This is where we sometimes get confused. We can obey and not necessarily be submissive. Or sometimes we can be submissive but totally refuse to obey. Obedience in a general form, and if you read some of the posts last night, I appreciate them. They were right on the money. I'm just going to summarize some of this. Obedience deals with our actions, our responsibilities, how we deal, what we do with authority, in authority, when authority figures, tells us to do something, gives us a command, a directive. Obedience is what we do next. Submission, on the other hand, to make a long definition short, simply deals with our attitude towards this authority. Yeah, I'll obey them because they told me to, but I sure don't think it's the right thing to do. Submission is about our attitude. God looks at our outward actions and at the hidden attitude of our hearts. And that's the very instruction that we can read. Actually, King David gave this to his son. Turn to 1 Chronicles chapter 28. 1 Chronicles chapter 28, read verse 9. It's pretty clear, these two factors, if you will, in this section of Scripture. 1 Chronicles 20 and verse 9 says, "As for you, my son Solomon, know the God of your father," and now listen to this, "and serve him with a loyal heart." There's the obedience. "And with a willing mind." And there is a submission. "For the Lord searches all hearts and understands all the intent of our thoughts. If you seek him, he will be found by you. But if you forsake him, he will cast you off forever." This is an extremely important section of Scripture for all of us in how we live our life, how we choose to move forward from this point on. This pandemic, this crisis that we're in right now. Did we see it coming? Not necessarily. Will there be another one coming? Very possible. It'll be a different one. It'll be a different way. Satan will keep throwing these roadblocks in front of us as a church to try to do his best to, number one, make us quit being obedient to God and to authorities, and number two, make us quit submitting to God and to the authorities. Are we going to cave? Are we going to do that? No. We better not. When we are not submissive to authorities, the short definition is basically we are resisting God's authority. All authority comes from God. But where do we draw the line? That's always a good question, right? Where do we draw the line? The Bible teaches unconditional submission to authority, but the Bible does not necessarily teach unconditional obedience. Think about that. There's an exception. The only exception, the only time when we are not to obey authority is when they tell us to do something that directly contradicts what God states in His Word. In other words, we are released from obeying only, and I say only with a capital O, only when these leaders tell us to sin. And that is when we don't do it. Other than that, we're supposed to do it. We're supposed to obey. We're supposed to submit. You think about this, even in those cases when we have a reason, a godly reason not to obey, even in those cases, we are to keep a humble and submissive attitude. And that's hard to do. It's very hard to do. But whether the authority is civil, whether it's family, whether it's church, or whether it's social, God admonishes us to maintain a very submissive attitude. We are also to obey the actions, again, unless the authority tells us to do something that very clearly goes against Scripture, very clearly identifies as sin, and then we're not to do it. So let me throw out a few questions for us to think about as we get into this. What do we think this issue, or maybe let me say why, I guess. Why should we think this issue matters so much to God? Think about that. Well, the simple answer is, what did Satan do? Does it matter to God? Absolutely it does. Does it matter to us? Well, brother, it absolutely should. How does it benefit those in authority? Ever think about that side of the coin? Have any of you ever been in a position of authority and then asked somebody to do something? And maybe, just maybe it didn't make a lot of sense, but there was nothing spiritually wrong with it. And they told you to take a flying leap. How'd that make you feel? I encourage each one of us to evaluate our attitude toward authority. And yes, I'm talking about God, but I'm also talking about civil authority. I'm talking about church authority. I'm talking about family authority. Do we make a practice of obeying our leaders with a willing heart? We have to ask God to give us the grace and the mercy not only to obey, but also to truly submit and have that in our heart. We have to ask for this because this is not something that is conducive to turning our human nature into a godly nature. We have to ask for God to help. So for the remainder of the time, I want to look at these two factors of obedience and submission. So let's go to the first one. I'm going to start with the obedience factor. The obedience factor. And again, you can look up definitions for obedience, and there's a long list of definitions, qualifications for obedience. I'm going to summarize it by 3 basic points, A, B, and C. They are, A, doing exactly what you're told, B, immediately, and C, with a happy heart. That's hard. It's hard to do sometimes. If we respect the authority figure and it's not blatant sin, then it's pretty easy for us to do. But if we don't respect the authority figure, even though it's not blatant sin, we tend to reject it. Obedience to God's commands. That's what we've got to keep in the back of our mind. Am I being obedient to God's command? I want to take a close look here at the actions of a man that I greatly admire, and it's not Paul this time, although I do. But this man, you could say in his time, was a man's man. He was the kind of guy that you thought he would stand up and he would go forward and he was strong and he could make decisions and they would be the right decisions and there was no issues there. This man was not afraid of anyone or anything, and it's the impression that we get. The only fear that this man had in his life was a healthy fear for God. That's what we're supposed to have, right? This is how we're supposed to be. The only fear that we're supposed to have is a healthy fear. I'm not going to turn there, but it's 1 John 4:18 talks about if we have fear, in general, fear, then fear is not of godly love. So we have to get rid of fear to allow godly love to grow in our hearts, in our minds, in our souls. But you see here, God asked this man to do something. He asked the man to do something that appeared to be absolutely ridiculous. That without a doubt, if this man done this, he would be laughed at by all his neighbors. His distant relatives would think he was crazy, think he already went off the deep end. As a matter of fact, the world, as it came to see what he was doing, would think this man has lost it. And not just for a few minutes, for more than 100 years, right at about 120 years. That's how long it took this man to do what God asked him to do. And I think you probably all know where I'm going. But think just for a minute. You and I would be asked, say we're asked to go out on a street corner and talk about the plan of God's salvation for about 10 to 15 minutes to passers-by. Do you think that we'd be ridiculed? For the most part, yes. Do you think that people would think, there's one of those crazy Bible thumpers? Yeah, that's what people would think. You feel like we'd be beating our head against the wall? Probably. You might get 1 or 2 people to stop and ask questions, but are they sincere? That's a whole new ballpark. But for God to give you a job that would take you 120 years to do, I mean, people, they would go to their grave thinking that, wow, you were just one crazy person who just completely flipped out. But you see, this man, he was different. Now, it doesn't have to be so much different than you and I, But he was different because he had total 100% complete faith in God. This man was about what God said and was doing. And he knew that God would never ask him to do something that wasn't absolutely 100% important to God's plan. You know, God doesn't waste our time. He doesn't give us suggestions or threaten us with false alarms. That's not who God is. God wants us to make the very most of every minute of our time. Everything that he's given us here on earth, he wants us to make the best of it. He gives us commands, and they're not suggestions, they're commands. But he never threatens us. He only warns us of the impeding dangers of the events if we don't follow his commands. Our story here, it actually starts back in the beginning. I'm going to turn to Genesis 1:1. You don't have to turn to Genesis 1:1 if you don't want, but you could start turning to Genesis chapter 6. We know this story. Genesis 1:1 says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." And it goes on. We know the story. Every day after this, God, in the recreation, God started creating. He created something. And I'm not going to take the time to read all this, but think about this. Every day when he finished his creating, what did he do? At the end of the day, he said, it was good. It was good. He looked at his creation, the plants, the animals, the stars, the moon, all this. He said, it was good. And then, when he created man, what did he say? He said, it was very good. Distinction there. It was very good. Unfortunately, by the time we get to Genesis chapter 6, God's perfect world that had become, that he created and said it was good, it was good, it was good, it was good, it was very good, it became corrupt. And it didn't become corrupt by the plants, by the animals, by the stars, by the moon, by the waters, the suns. It came corrupt by man's poor choice. The thing that he said was very good. The very man that he created was very good. Man's poor choices. It came so corrupt that God said he was actually sorry he ever made man. Wow, how bad did it get? Genesis 6, verse 6 and 7. And the Lord was sorry that he made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. So the Lord said, I will destroy man, whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, creeping thing, and birds of the air, for I am sorry that I have made them. 2 times in these 2 verses, he said he was sorry that he made us. The very thing that he said was very good. Now that is sad. We take something so perfect, so exquisite that God made and turned it into something so evil, so corrupt, so unrepentant that God became sorry that he even made us. But there was one saving grace here. One person had not been affected by the surrounding corruption. And that is so impressive to understand this. This man still was a sinner. Don't you get wrong there. He was a sinner by birth and by his actions. But his heart, his attitude, his mind, that belonged to God. He was living righteous and holy in a real world that became so corrupt and evil. We can use this, and we should use this as an example in our life. Brother, we've not seen anything yet. It has not even gotten to the days of Noah yet. We should take this as an example in our life. It is possible. Let me repeat that. It is possible, brother, for us to stand up for what is right, to live in a way that absolutely will please God, no matter what everybody else is doing. That's what Noah did here. Let's continue on here in Genesis 6, verses 8, starting in verse 8, we'll read down through about 22, I believe. Let's start reading in this. Genesis chapter 6, starting in verse 8. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. This is the genealogy of Noah. Noah was a just man, perfect in his generation. Noah walked with God, and Noah begot 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. How many of us would stand out in a crowd like Noah did? You think about what just became, or what progressively became, known as a corrupt society, but Noah didn't give in. How many of us, brethren, would be able to stick out like that? How many of us would God look down and say, I'm going to pick you out of this world of 7+ billion people? How does God see us in the middle of this world that is becoming ever more corrupt? Let's read on, verse 11. The earth was also corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. So God looked upon the earth, and indeed it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. And God said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood, make rooms in the ark, and cover it inside and outside with pitch. Verse 15. And this is how you shall make it. The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, its width 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits. You shall make a window for the ark, and you shall finish it to a cubit from above, and set the door of the ark in its side. You shall make it with lower, second, and third decks. And behold, I myself am bringing floodwaters on the earth to destroy from under heaven all flesh in which is the breath of life. Everything that is on the earth shall die. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall go into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you. And of every living thing, of all flesh, you shall bring 2 of every sort into the ark, to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female, of the birds after their kind, of animals after their kind, of every creeping thing of the earth after its kind. 2 of every kind will come to you to keep them alive. You shall take for yourself all food that is eaten, and you shall gather it to yourself, and it shall be food for you and for them. I originally thought about just reading up to about verse 13 and stopping, but I thought, no. The rest of this story makes the point. The point that it wasn't like God said, go build yourself an ark, get in there, and shut it up, and I'll save you and your family. He said, no, this is what I want you to do. I want you to do this, build this ark, do it this way, put these kind of animals in it, these kind of birds in it, put enough food and provisions in it for all the animals for you. My point is, there was a lot of things here for Noah to obey and to be submissive to. Do you think Noah's first response was, okay, sure? Or do you think maybe some of these following thoughts might have entered his mind? Let me just shoot a couple of thoughts out here that maybe they entered his mind. Who could believe that this wise God who created the world would be ready to destroy it so soon? Do you think that entered his mind? How about this? The God who had just drawn the waters off the dry land would cause him to cover it again. Could that enter Noah's mind? How about this? How could such a merciful God allow such devastation, especially to allow innocent creatures to die for man's sins? How about that? How about this? Where could enough water to cover the whole earth ever come from? You think, maybe you thought that. And how about this? I'll throw you one more out here. If it was going to happen, why was Noah the only one told about it? You see, brethren, these reasons that I just threw out there, they're very human reasonings. But here's the thing. Noah's relationship with God was so strong and his faith was so sure that it didn't matter if he understood any of these reasons or not. It didn't matter. Maybe he did have some of these thoughts. Maybe he had a lot more of these thoughts. It doesn't matter. That's beside the point. He knew that God told him to do something. And God didn't just say, no, I think I'm going to do this. I would think, or I'd suggest maybe if you get time, go do this. No, God commanded, say, Noah, this is what I'm going to do. This is what I want you to do. Even though I'm sure the length of time that it would take to build this ark, to get these animals together, to get all these preparations together, how expensive it would be, how hard to build something to those exact details. From a human perspective, that might be overwhelming. What we have to remember is God implanted in Noah's mind the directions to do all this. But what about you and me, brethren? Are we obedient? Is our faith strong enough to obey the decisions that are given to us, even if we might not fully understand or fully agree with them? Even if we think that there may be another way to do something, as long as it doesn't contradict God's law, will we obey? And that's really what it comes down to. And that's a decision that each one of us have to make personally. It's a choice. God tells us what to do, but God also said, choose life, that you and your family, your household may live. Noah's response to God was immediate obedience. Let's review that definition of obedience again that I gave to you as we started. Obedience is A, doing exactly what we're told to do, B, immediately, and C, with a happy heart. Do we have that when somebody asks us to do something? Look at verse 22. Thus Noah did according to all that God commanded him, so he did. So, what did God tell him to do? God said, Noah, among other things, build an ark. What did Noah do? He built an ark. When God did tell him to do it, when did he do it? Immediately. He started immediately. How did God tell him to do it? God said, do it with all your might. Get on it. Start. What did Noah do? He did it with all his might. He did it with a happy heart. All that Noah did here represents complete obedience. He may not have understood everything that was happening, the ramifications of everything that, if he didn't do it, would have happened. He might have understood all this. He may have, but we don't know that. The bottom line is, he obeyed. What was the outcome of Noah's obedience? Righteous Noah, with his 7 other family members, were saved, along with all the species of animals that were required. God blessed him, and God promised him that he would never destroy the earth again with water. Noah did exactly what he was told. He did it immediately, and he did it with a submissive, happy heart. So that is why, brethren, we are told to obey. Because God knows all. We can trust him. And anything he tells us to do is for a reason. We must learn to obey God the way that we want our children to obey us. It's kind of hypocritical if we expect our children to obey us and yet we don't obey our Father. By doing exactly what we are told to do from God and from authorities, this is what we expect our children to do. This is the way obedience works. Doing it immediately and doing it with a happy heart. So what about us, brethren? Do we have a willing heart of obedience? Is it always better to obey willingly than to be forced to obey? Well, sure. We do not at all want God to take his hands, I should say, of blessings and protection off of us. And I think the last 6 weeks or so have been a great testimony to that very fact. We know we need God, but we want to always remember that we need God. Never forget that. So this brings us to our second point, the submission factor. You know, we, as humans, we need boundaries. That's just kind of the way it is. Because of our sinful nature, we don't always follow rules, especially those of God. It is human nature to want things and to want them our way and to think that we know how they should be done better than those telling us. Human nature of itself has never been one to promote rules, and especially rules and regulations that pertain to God and his way of life. Ever since man's first sin, our nature has been to rebel against the very idea of submission and authority. Why is that? Well, that's because that's exactly what Satan did. He did it before us, and he brought that theme, that process of thinking into the world so you and I would accept it and fall into it. That's what he did. So the very first thing that we need to do, and we talked about this over the year, but especially in the last 3 or 4 weeks, is self-examination. We need to examine ourselves and then redirect and change our thinking if it's not in line with God and his way of thinking. And that makes us think of the word submission. We need to change it to a good thing. Right now, human nature says the word submission is a bad word. It's one of those ugly 4-letter words, a lot more letters than 4, but that's kind of what we think. When somebody says, you need to submit, immediately we think, wow, that's a bad command. The fact is, it's not a bad word at all. It is a very liberating word. We are under God's protection and God's authority. And we can only be free if we seek that. And then if we seek it, we have to submit to it. Let's go to Psalms chapter 91. Psalms chapter 91, verse 1 and 2. Psalms 91, starting at verse 1. As for you, the one who lives in the shelter of the Most High and resides in the protective shadow of the Sovereign One, I say this about the Lord, my shelter and my stronghold, my God, in whom I trust. Does that describe us, brethren? Do we put our trust, our faith in God? Do we have our trust in submitting to authority, being under submission? This is why we as Christians have such a great responsibility to not only obey, but to submit. And again, not only to God, but to the laws of humanity, as long as they don't require us to break God's laws. Always keep that in mind. That's the only out. We might not like it, we might not agree with it, but if it doesn't require us to break God's laws, we have to submit to it. Submitting to both the authority of God's laws and man's laws, again, as long as they don't require us to sin, that was designed for our protection. Living free is our opportunity to be all that God has created us to be. And that's the only way we can do it. You know, the world has the view that if one was to submit to any type of authority, then it would be the same as admitting being weak. And that couldn't be further from the truth. That's not how God set authority up, the hierarchy of government. That's not how he set it up. This is the same type of thinking that sees authority, all authority, as oppressive and unjust. But look at what Peter pointed out here. Go to 1 Peter chapter 2. I think Peter clears this up quite nicely. 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 13 through 15. Therefore, submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake. Remember that phrase right there. Submit yourself to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether to the king as supreme or the governors, as to those who are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers, and for the praise of those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. So, do we see what Peter said here? The Greek word translated for submit, as I will attempt to pronounce this, omoisos. It's O-M-O-I-O-S. I probably butchered the pronunciation of that, but it means, it's a military term, meaning to place oneself in subjection to authority, whoever, but place oneself in subjection to. And that's what he said. Therefore, submit. Therefore, place yourself in subjection to. And he goes on to say, every ordinance of men. Why? Because God said to, for the Lord's sake. This place oneself in subjection to, it's the same connotation as like a private would be to a drill sergeant at boot camp. That kind of maybe brings a little better light on it. It literally means to obey a higher authority. This means that as Christians, we don't only submit to God and his authority, but we are to submit to every authority instituted among men. Again, as long, and I'll keep saying this, as long as they don't require us to sin. And that is what we have to evaluate. Join me in Romans chapter 13. Romans chapter 13, verse 1 and 2. Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God. Understand that. And the authority that exists are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God. And those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. That pretty well sums it up. If we want to bring judgment on ourselves, resist authority. Now, if that authority tells us to do something wrong, even if it's not against God's law, they are responsible for that, not us. We submitted. We followed God's command to submit to government authorities. The people, the ones in authority, have to answer for that. Look at Titus chapter 3. Titus chapter 3, verse 1 and 2. Remind them to be subject to rulers and authorities, to obey, to be ready for every good work, to speak evil of no one, to be peaceable, gentle, showing all humility to all men. This is our command. So he's telling us to be submissive, to obey, but in doing that, we are to be ready for every good work. He says to don't talk bad about them, don't speak evil of them, to be peaceable, be gentle, showing all humility to all men. We have to be humble in doing this. This means all federal, state, local governments, as well as our church governments, doctrines, rules, regulations. God expects us to obey and be submissive to the rules that are and have been established. Those include everything from paying our taxes, obeying the Constitution, the directives of the church, all of them, down to obeying traffic lights, stop signs, not littering. Some of these are huge, some of them are small. We're required to obey and submit to the level or decree of authority that these possess. That is what we're supposed to do. That's what we're called to do. We have to be the example in that. We are commanded to place ourselves in a position of subjection and obedience to these rulers, their rules, the regulations, and to the laws that they govern. And again, it goes back to unless they go against God's laws. And the thing is, it's not just rules that we must obey. We are called to obey all positions of authority, such as our parents, the very basic one. I'm going to turn here. Ephesians 6:1 tells us, it says, children, obey your parents as in the Lord. Why? For this is right. That's what Paul tells us in Ephesians 6, verse 1. How about our bosses? How about our teachers? The list goes on and on. It can be very, very long. All of us, the bottom line is, we have several people that we are commanded to submit to. Unfortunately, sometimes in the church, we get the idea that we only have to obey and submit to God and Jesus Christ. And that's not what God or Jesus Christ says, and I hope we've seen that. This is not a command that we as Christians are to take lightly, or a command that we are to scoff at. In fact, it is a very serious command that certainly does demand obedience. The reason for all this, according to Peter, who just read, was to do it for the sake of the Lord. So, the motivation here is not just to avoid punishment, but it's to honor God. Do we realize that? When we submit to authority, as long as it doesn't tell us to sin, and the local authorities, and the church authorities, when we do this, do we realize that that's honoring God? So God wants us to submit to authority. If we don't respect authority, how can we claim to respect God? God is the ultimate authority. Again, if we don't submit to our parents, we are, in essence, disobeying God. If we don't submit ourselves to the laws of the country and the state, as long as they don't require us to sin, no matter how crazy we might think they are or how much we maybe don't understand them, if we don't submit, then we are disobeying God. Notice what Paul says back in Romans 13. Romans 13, I'm going to read verse 1 and 2 again, but I'm going to go down through verse 5. Romans 13, starting verse 1. Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For he is God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is God's minister, an avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. Therefore, you must be subject, not only because of the wrath, but also for conscience sake. So again, it's not just about obeying because we think we've done something wrong or we might have to suffer consequences, but it's a mental state. We want to have peace of mind. God says about that peace that surpasses all understanding. All that ties into this. Just as Paul said here in verse 2, I'm not going to go back to Peter, or Paul said here, then in verse 2, Peter, in 1 Peter 2, that these authorities are sent by him, by God. So, although human laws are literally written by man, God is still the sender of these. And his idea, he uses here higher authority to send out lesser authorities, all of which we are to obey. Sometimes this seems like it can be overwhelming. One of the hard things to do, though, is to respect the leaders of this world, because they have made some, what seems like very unwise decisions, at least from our perspective. Now, I'm not talking about only Satan. We know Satan is the leader of this world, and he does make decisions that promote his agenda. But I'm speaking of, authorities, the president, all members of Congress, and we could really get talking about all that. But others who make and change the laws of the land that we live by, that affect you and I every day. Sometimes it's hard to respect these leaders and the leadership. The thing is, brethren, God allowed who he wants to be in office for his purpose, not necessarily for our purpose. And we'd like to think everything is done for our purpose. Now, Romans 8:28 says everything happens for the good of those who love God and seek his commandments. But here, we have to understand that God puts people in office who he wants in office to allow his plan to be worked out here on earth. There is a plan that God is working out. We know this. Sometimes it's hard for us to remember that they are God's servants. Maybe we didn't think of them as God's servants, but they are God's servants for his purpose. Now, they may not be Christians, they may not believe the way we do, but they still are his servants. They're serving his purpose. And again, God has established, and he's put them where he wants them for his purpose and his reason to be worked out here on earth. And I am so thankful that God is in charge, because some of the things that we see and understand, we don't see how it can ever work out, but God does. God knows, and that is where our faith and trust go into him. I look back at the lesson, this very thing, the lesson from as far back as the Pharaoh in Egypt. Join me in Exodus chapter 9. Notice what Moses wrote here. Exodus chapter 9, verse 16 here, God tells the Pharaoh here through Moses. Now, this was the seventh plague, if you remember, the plague of hail. He says here in verse 16, this is what God's telling him. But indeed, for this purpose, I have raised you up, that I may show my power in you, and that my name may be declared in all the earth. If you read the whole context around that, you'll see what God's talking about here. We do not always see God's purpose. We know the plan, and we know the end of the plan, but we don't always see his purpose for today and tomorrow and the next day, and why he's doing what he's doing, and why he's allowed to happen what he's allowed to happen. But you know what? That really shouldn't concern us. I mean, we think about it and we have to live it, but our concern is simply being obedient and being submissive to these leaders and rulers as God requires, and supporting them as God requires. What God's will is, as Peter said, is that by doing good, we will silence the ignorant talk of foolish men. We just read all this. He goes on to say, if we are obedient and submissive and are punished or persecuted, then the world will see that we have been wronged. Been wronged for God's sake, not for our sake. And God will be glorified. And even the rulers, it says, will be silenced. He goes on to say that the world will have no case against us. No case, just as they had no case against Christ. They had no case against Peter. They had no case against Paul. And By being obedient to authority, we will silence those who seek to persecute and mistreat us. And again, by this, guess what? God will be glorified. All this is found in 1 Peter 2, verse 13 through 25. You could go back and read, we read most of that, but you can go back and read that again. But never forget, brethren, that God has a purpose for us. He has a purpose for those authority figures in our lives. They are his servants to train us so that we are to submit to them. Why? As Peter said, for the Lord's sake, to give God room to work in and through the situation. So, what is our attitude toward all the rules and regulations and laws that have been placed in authority over us? What is our attitude? How do we handle it? Do we pray and put it in God's hands and move forward? Or do we fight it? Brother, just remember that God absolutely hates disobedience and rebellion. But he absolutely loves his servants who submit themselves to authorities that God has ordained. So let all of us take a moment to very carefully examine where we stand in our actions and our motives toward authority. We need to really think about this, especially as the times we're in now. And it's probably not going to get a whole lot better leading up to Christ's return. Let us make sure that our actions and our motives are in line with what Peter said when he said to respect everyone, continually honoring the king, continually have love for our fellow Christians, and continually fear God. Brethren, let's put this into our minds and our hearts and put it into action. And by doing this wholeheartedly and truly, let's all be the most spiritually obedient and submissive children of God that we can absolutely be.